Oh, we're on? Hello, everybody, and welcome to our presentation of Life in the 50s. I'm your host, Mark Rosen, and this is my co-host,
Brittany.
And guest starring in the audience, we have a very special guest star,
Cindy.
That's right, Cindy's here as well. Get ready to have some fun. Or as they'd say in the 50s, a blast, man.
Would they say that?
They wouldn't say that, no. They'd say daddy-o. I like this first photo just because I have a sister about the same age as myself, and this just looks like how we would look at each other. Like one of us would kick each other under the table.
Back in the 50s, Mark?
Back in the 50s, we'd kick each other under the table, and we'd both looking at who's... I'm not going to say anything. We don't want to get in trouble. But yeah, this is a kind of a classic 50s photo. You see the striped shirts, the little dress, the Wonder Bread there. The milk, I mean, it's just a very classic 50s motif. The spoons, I mean, nowadays, we don't use spoons, but we certainly used them in the 50s. That was a little bit of snark, Brittany, wasn't it?
A little bit.
There was a tad of snark in there. This is life in the 50s.
Oh, there we are, Cindy.
There we are.
Yeah, there's Brittany and Cindy, and I'm not sure who the other person was, probably that friend that you didn't like us.
That's our friend, Fran.
Fran, yeah. You guys didn't really like Fran that much, though. She was kind of annoying.
No, she was kind of mean sometimes.
For those in the audience, can you take a guess at where these ladies are? Now, you can probably guess by what they're holding in their hands that they're students.
Well, Mark, it looks like they're outside.
Yes, Brittany, thank you. They are outside, but can you tell what Minnesota location this is? It doesn't look much different today. If you guessed the University of Minnesota, you would be absolutely 100,000% correct. And notice in the 50s, it wasn't really appropriate in those days for women to wear jeans. So a lot of times women wore skirts. Even when it's clearly still spring and it's still a little chilly out, they're in skirts.
Burr.
Burr. I think if Brittany lived in the 50s, this is exactly what you would look like.
Absolutely.
That'd be your hairstyle and everything.
Mm-hmm. You know, I often think, Mark, that I was born in the wrong era.
You're an old soul.
I am.
Semi-old.
So, audience members, I think this photograph might look familiar to you. You know, in the 50s and the early 60s, shows were brought to you, they were sponsored by one single sponsor. It wasn't 15 minutes of ads or whatever it is in between shows. It was actually, the show was brought to you by, in this case, Shell Oil. This is CCO, this would be CBS in the Twin Cities, or Channel 4. And this is Bud Kraling the Weatherman. And Brittany and Cindy, notice how high-tech things were in the 1950s.
They were. I remember that.
I mean, they literally were just drawing in. You can see that in Minnesota, the high of the day is 64 degrees. The low would be 35. The wind is 15 to 20 miles an hour coming out the northwest. I mean, this is very high-tech stuff here. Do any of you remember Bud Kraling and the CCO Weather Tower? How about Shell Oil, for that matter? You don't see many Shell Oil stations anymore.
The bus is going to St. Paul.
Now you're all saying, what is that? That's actually not a bus.
Oh, it's a cable car.
Believe it or not, this is a streetcar. How many of you recall taking the streetcar? I bet a lot of you do. It only cost maybe a dime or maybe a quarter. It was incredibly clean, incredibly safe. No one in the Twin Cities was ever killed by a streetcar. Do you know that? Buses have had accidents, but no one's ever been run over by a streetcar in Minnesota. And amazingly, Brittany, the 1950s really spelled the end of the streetcar era in Minnesota, as the streetcar commissioner purposely bankrupted the system in favor of the bus companies. And the streetcars went into the Great Lakes.
You know, there's talk today, Mark, about they're going to open up Nicollet Avenue again with the Kmart being sold. So they're talking about bringing the streetcars back.
That is amazing.
A piece of Minneapolis, St. Paul history right there.
We had one of the most complete and effectual streetcar systems in the country. We dumped them all in the Great Lakes. We sold them to Canada or Mexico. Believe it or not, it's true. And now for several $1 billion, we're reinventing the wheel.
You dumped them in the Great Lakes?
We did. We dumped some of them in the Great Lakes. Some of them they set on fire. Some they actually sent to Mexico or Canada. Matter of fact, one of the old streetcars was dredged up from the lakes and taken, sort of put back together and runs a very short distance around, I don't know, is it Como Lake? There was a streetcar.
Lake Harriet.
Maybe it's Lake Harriet. Well, this is Minnesota, and even in, of course, the 50s, going to the lakes for recreation, for a day of recreation was what we did. This is a family, this is actually Brittany's family.
Yes, Mark. 7 children.
That's an incredible feat. Mazel tov.
If I were alive in the 50s, I would be seen on a boat like this with my friends.
That's me right here. You can tell by the light brown hair and the blue eyes.
You see the resemblance.
I look a lot like him. This is a family having a great time on a motorboat. Notice it has wood paneling. You don't see that on motorboats really very much anymore. And this is on Lake Minnetonka, which back then as well as today, this was the top lake for recreation in the state of Minnesota. Do many of you have memories of heading up to the lakes on the weekends or maybe for a short vacation? And if so, where did you go? Matter of fact, Brittany, did you ever spend time up at the lake with your family?
We would go to a cabin periodically in the summertime. We did a lot of camping.
Not as much water.
Up north by, Duluth,
Okay.
Lutsen, those areas.
There's a big lake up there in Duluth, isn't there?
Yes, Lake Superior.
It's a little,
It's a little too big of a lake to be doing this, though.
That's probably true. And of course, in the 1950s, Minnesota, the Twin Cities, had one of the top basketball teams in the country, the Minneapolis Lakers. I bet that rings a bell for all of you, the Minneapolis Lakers. And Vern Mickelson was one of their stars. And simply because we couldn't offer them a stadium, they became the Los Angeles Lakers, and still are to this day. It's sad.
It is. It makes more sense to have a team called the Lakers in Minnesota.
Than in LA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. And as much as I love the Timberwolves, they're not quite the Lakers. They don't win quite as much. The Lakers were a championship team all the way. We're going to skip a little bit of the verbiage here because we want to keep on going. But this is interesting. This is what did it cost in the 50s, Brittany? And so we can see we have a 50s style, a classic Rambler, the one car attached garage. Most people didn't have 2-car garages or 2 cars in those days, but a lot of people dreamt about moving into the suburbs, which were just expanding in the 50s. Having a yard, a backyard, a white picket fence, a dog named Toto, and, an attached garage. Maybe the dog wasn't Toto, but,
One can dream.
This, of course, is a poster for a new Nash Rambler. And here is a delicious, juicy steak. That is actually a photograph I took yesterday for my grill.
Of your dinner.
Of my dinner. Now, the question for all of you is, what do you think these things cost in the 1950s? What do you think a brand new house would cost in the 50s? What did a brand new Nash Rambler cost? And how much would you pay for a steak dinner?
Let's find out.
Let's find out. Well, it turns out in the 1950s, this Nash Rambler was $11,000. And actually, that was quite expensive for an automobile. Many automobiles were much less, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 for a brand new automobile. The steak dinner would run you $4.
A little more expensive now.
You'd have to put another 0, and that would not be for a very nice steak restaurant. That'd be for Ruby Tuesdays. And the house, $9,500.
Cheaper than the car.
That's right, $9,000 for a brand new Rambler-style home in the suburbs. That is really incredible, isn't it?
It's a little more today.
So again, think about how much you might have spent on your first home, the first car that you purchased. Do you remember spending just a few dollars to have a nice dinner, delicious dinner? $4 would get you a Happy Meal at McDonald's. Maybe.
Maybe.
If few more prices we won't spend too much time on. I think it's interesting to note that milk was almost $1.
Yeah.
So milk has always been expensive.
Gas was 20 cents a gallon.
That would be good.
Bread was 14 cents, and a postage stamp was 3 cents.
And Brittany, that square cotton square dance cotton check dress you were always wanting, $3.29.
Amazing.
All right, this is actually a photograph of, guess who? It's the Fonz. You thought you were going to say me, right?
I thought you were going to say Mark.
Well, I do look a lot like him. That is Henry Winkler playing the Fonz. Hey! In the show Happy Days, and these are just some slang terms. Boss, which meant cool. Bread, which was, what was bread in the 50s? It wasn't bread, it was money.
Ah.
Oh my gosh. Souped up, that wasn't a can of tomato soup from Campbell's. That's something you did to your engine. Make your car go faster or work better. Threads, well, those were clothes. And man, if you were cool, you'd say, hey, daddy-o.
Do you ever use those terms, Mark?
I still sometimes use those terms. Hey, look at all that bread in the wallet. No, I never say that when I look in my
This
wallet.
makes me hungry.
I'm hungry right now for soup. Here are some faces of the 50s. Do you recognize these faces? This is another hairstyle I've been telling Brittany she should really consider.
I'm still thinking about it.
She's still going to consider it. Of course, you recognize that is Dwight and Mamie Eisenhower. That's right. Truman left office in 1952, and in came Dwight D. Eisenhower. I like Ike, right? And Eisenhower was president throughout almost the entire decade, from 52 to I can't do my math very well, to 1960, Eisenhower was your president. So growing up in the 50s, Dwight was your man, Mamie was the first lady, just like when I was growing up in the 80s, Ronald Reagan was pretty much all I really knew as a president. And Dwight Eisenhower oversaw a lot of expansion. The interstates, etc. Our country really transformed to the most prosperous nation on earth in the 1950s. Can anyone guess who this is? Now, since you're not sitting in the room with us, we can't hear your answer. But if you guessed Joltin' Joe DiMaggio, you're right. And by the way, he played for the Yankees. What famous actress, what famous blonde bombshell was Joe DiMaggio married to? Yep, you guessed it right. Marilyn Monroe. And it's an interesting photograph of Marilyn Monroe, isn't it?
She's thinking about something.
She's pondering something. What do you think she's pondering?
Maybe she's deciding what to have for dinner.
Does she want that steak for $4
Yes.
at steak dinner?
Yes.
I would say yes, by the way. Of course, Marilyn Monroe was the big actress of The 7-Year Itch and Some Like It Hot and many other films, and she did die tragically young. Lucy, you got some explaining to do. Of course, the most popular sitcom of the 1950s was I Love Lucy. Can you name the two actors in this photograph? If you said Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, you're absolutely correct. And it's a pretty incredible story for the two of them because Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, they came up with the idea of I Love Lucy, and they went to the different producers of the networks, and they all said, well, we love the concept, and we're definitely going to do it, but Desi, you can't be the husband, because America's not ready to accept a Latino husband and a white woman as his wife. And Lucille Ball said, I'm not doing the show, no matter how much money you offer me, unless my husband Desi is the husband in the show. And by the way, were they ever right?
They hit it off.
They hit it off. I Love Lucy is one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. Only really went off the air because the two got a divorce eventually.
Walt Disney.
Yes, when you think of the 1950s, you really think of the advent of the feature animated picture, right? There was animation before Walt Disney, but the idea of a feature film, an hour-and-a-half film that's animated, when he came up with the idea of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, no one thought this was a good idea. They all thought he was absolutely crazy. Disney even mortgaged his home, used his life savings. Well, what happened? Snow White was a huge hit. He won an Academy Award. No one called him crazy after that. And later in the 50s would come Disneyland. And of course, you can name the characters here. Mickey Mouse. What's the name of that duck? Donald. And of course, my favorite character, because I can really relate to him, Goofy. I'm sure you'd agree, Brittany.
I agree.
Brittany, I don't know how this happened, but your high school yearbook photo got slipped into the slideshow.
Darn, did that sneak in there again?
I think you put it there.
You caught me, Mark.
So, this famous actress from the 1950s also became a princess of Monaco. What is her name? You know, it's strange because you're not in the audience with us people, so you can't really answer us, but hopefully what you said was Grace Kelly. That is the beautiful and very talented Grace Kelly. She could act, she could sing, she had great hair, and she had everything going for her. And at some point she meets Prince Rainier of Monaco, and they get married. And she quits Hollywood because he wasn't going to allow her to work in the movies and be a princess. It was the 50s. Fly me to the moon, let me play amongst the stars. Scooby-Dooby, Snoopy, Snoop. All right. Well, who is this guy? He's the chairman of the board. Old Blue Eyes, the class act, #1, the King of Vegas. We're looking at
Frankie himself.
Frank Sinatra. The 50s, really a mixed decade for Frank Sinatra. He came into the 50s strong, but believe it or not, by 1951-52, he had lost his recording contract. The studios dropped him. He actually was finished in the early 50s. It was thanks to his ex-wife, Ava Gardner, that he got a shot at a role in a movie called From Here to Eternity. She had to basically beg the director to give Frank the role. He had once been the biggest thing since Swiss cheese, and now she's begging the director to get him on the screen. He wins an Academy Award for the role. He's back on top, and for the rest of the 50s, no one could touch Old Blue Eyes, Frank Sinatra. You know, often, Brittany, I think of myself when I think of Frank, because I have those same striking blue eyes and that same kind of gritty.
Do you wear a lot of fedoras?
I wear fedoras just about every day. So, you know, there's a different side of the 50s. Up until now, we've been looking at nostalgia, wouldn't you say? Mm-hmm. I Love Lucy, great TV show, the streetcars.
Steak dinners.
Steak dinners for $4, boating on Lake Minnetonka. But there was a darker side of the 50s. There was rampant anti-Semitism in the 50s. It was not an easy time to be a woman and try to be in business or to be, self-sustaining in the 50s. And for African Americans, it was a particularly difficult time. Jim Crow was still very real in the South, and up in the North, we still had plenty of discrimination. And in the 1950s, an event occurred we know as the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which really kicked off the civil rights movement. And what you're seeing here is a hero of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, a nurse who was tired, got on the bus. The driver said, "Get to the back of the bus," so this white patron could sit in her seat. She said no. She got arrested, and bang. The press was all over it. They sent Martin Luther King Jr. down to Montgomery, and Rosa Parks really becomes a civil rights icon, and rightly so. And by the way, the defiance of Rosa Parks to this Jim Crow law really led to the desegregation of all transportation in the country. Well, it's 1 for the money, 2 for the show, 3 to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you step on my blue suede shoes. That's right, Barry Manilow, everybody. That is Barry Manilow.
So close, Mark.
Oh, not Barry Manilow. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry, Elvis Presley. I get the two confused all the time. That is right. That is the king of rock and roll, Brit.
Just look at that hair.
Look at that hair. I have hair like that.
You do.
I don't even know what to do with all my hair. That is a wonderful, and this photograph of Elvis is rather iconic. When this was taken, he was still in high school. That, believe it or not, is a high school photograph of Elvis. He was very shy, and the only time he really broke out of his shell when he was holding a guitar and he was performing. For some reason, when he performed for a group, he would show all that charisma, all that confidence, but he was actually a quite quiet kid in school. So we all know the story of Elvis, and if you don't, we should do a program on him sometime. But just like Marilyn Monroe dominated the box office, Frank Sinatra dominated the music charts, well, Elvis Presley really was the king of rock and roll. Brittany, let's look at some highlights of the 50s, shall we?
I would love to.
What's going on here in this photograph?
This is a picture of the Interstate 94 in Wisconsin.
I remember I mentioned that Eisenhower really started the idea of the Interstate Project. Now, we know that it allows us to drive productively from one part of the country to the other. Without the interstates, it took a lot longer to get from one place to the next. But the idea of the interstate, Brittany, was really if there was an emergency, let's say some kind of natural disaster, or God forbid an invasion from Cuba or an invasion of the Soviets through Alaska, we needed to get equipment, medical personnel, or soldiers from one side of the country to the other, and there was no quick way to do it. The interstate was really a way to move equipment, materials, and troops quickly from one end of the country to the other, but we all know now that it allows us to basically drive 75 miles an hour to get to Madison.
Or the Wisconsin Dells.
Or the Dells, which is where I'd rather go.
Why are these women wearing sashes and dresses?
This right here, I believe, is like Miss Wisconsin, perhaps. And this right here is Miss New Hope. It's very big, very prestigious.
If you look closely, it looks like it says Miss Concrete.
I didn't realize there was a Miss Concrete pageant, but we're going to look into that, people. I don't know if I'd want to be Miss Concrete.
I wouldn't either.
Well, we mentioned, of course, Rosa Parks. The 50s were the time of desegregation. Rosa Parks and the desegregation of transportation, but also the Brown versus the Board of Education and the desegregation of the schools. Many of you will remember watching on TV as governors from places like Arkansas, Mississippi, and others defied those orders, and Eisenhower actually had to send in the National Guard people, the National Guard, to desegregate those schools. You know, in the 50s, we really were worried about the atomic bomb. The Russians got the bomb. People were really seriously afraid there could be a nuclear event, and if there were, where would they go? So thousands and thousands of Americans shelled out more money than they probably could afford and built underground what? Bomb shelters. Do any of you remember bomb shelters? You know, Brittany, you can still buy homes to this day that have bomb shelters.
Really?
A lot of the owners didn't get rid of them or fill them in. They're still there. Really, you could just use it as extra storage.
Look at that.
Well, we also know that the 50s was what? The age of television. TVs first came out for the masses really in late 1948, 1949. But most Americans did not have TVs until the mid-50s. So it was fairly rare in the late 40s, early 50s to have a TV set. By the mid-late 50s, thanks to people like Milton Berle, Jack Benny, Ed Sullivan, and others, people really began to purchase TV sets. They didn't want to miss that show, and they didn't want to go to Uncle Bill's home to watch Milton Berle. They'd rather just be in their own home. And so you could see how small the TV sets were. That was a 10-inch screen there, Britt.
Wow.
Yeah, so people would sit rather close. You can see her drinking a bottle of Coca-Cola. I think this photograph reminds many of you watching right now of your youth, maybe as a young adult or even as a child, remembering sitting in the family room or the living room, sitting around the TV set, watching one of those old TV shows on that black and white TV.
Mm-hmm.
What TV show were you watching, Brittany?
In the 50s?
Mm-hmm.
I would have been watching I Love Lucy.
Yeah, I would too. So this is just a sample of some of the really popular shows of the 1950s. Can you name some of these celebrities? Well, on the far left, Brittany, we've got Milton Berle, Mr. Saturday Night, Mr. TV. We've got in the middle. Now, this was, again, one of the big sitcoms of the 50s, and I gotta be honest with you, I know I'm gonna offend some of you, I apologize. I've watched reruns of the show, I never laugh at it, but this is Leave It to Beaver. Leave It to Beaver. And the young boy here is Beaver Cleaver. His mother was June, the father, of course, Ward, and the older brother, Wally. They were the Cleavers, Britt.
Mm-hmm. I've seen reruns of that.
Ed Sullivan. You talk about variety shows of the 50s. Really started out with like acts like Jack Benny and Milton Berle, but over time, Ed Sullivan really took over. He really became the king of the variety show. And there were a lot of game shows in the 50s, Brittany, and one of the very popular ones was What's My Line? Because it would feature celebrities.
What was the gist of that show?
Well, you can see they're wearing blindfolds. And a famous person would come on, and they would have to disguise their voice. So Elizabeth Taylor would talk in a really weird voice that wasn't her own, and then the contestants on What's My Line could ask questions. Almost like 20 questions. And they would have to see who could guess it was Elizabeth Taylor.
I see.
But again, Elizabeth Taylor would be talking in some high squeaky voice or some low voice. So it was it was the 50s, and game shows would evolve over time into things like Jeopardy and Family Feud, but they did start with games like What's My Line? Mm-hmm. And as we mentioned, the 1950s, the birth of rock and roll. Really born out of the blues as well as country music. And you can see a lot of the early rock and roll stars were country rockers themselves. We've got Johnny Cash here, we've got Elvis Presley, we've got Carl Perkins here, and we've got Jerry Lee Lewis, Great Balls of Fire. So these were all, and of course a very young Elvis Presley. And they were all on one label, Brittany. Can you believe that?
Wow.
You seem impressed by that.
I am, truly.
And as I mentioned, the 50s, it was time for the birth of suburbia. That's when people began leaving the rural areas of America, leaving the cities that were getting crowded and more expensive, and they began finding homes in Edina and Bloomington and Richfield, and even later, New Hope, my hometown. This looks an awful lot like your house.
Does it?
Yeah, didn't you grow up in a house like this? And
I grew up in a farm, Mark.
that's your pa. Oh, you did. We'll keep moving on.
It's close.
Well, there was only one baseball team in the 50s that topped them all. No one could beat who? The Yankees, right? There were a lot of great teams, the LA Dodgers, there were a lot of great ones, the Cardinals, the Browns, etc., but no one won as many World Series and championships as the Yanks because they paid the best salaries and they had the best players. And if you look at this photograph here alone, you've got several legends. Mickey Mantle on the far right, Elston Howard, Roger Maris. I mean, they had the best of the best of the best. Of the best. The Yankees. There was even a musical called Damn Yankees.
Mm-hmm.
In Minnesota, we didn't have a Metrodome, we didn't have Target Field. Many of you remember going to where? Metropolitan Stadium, right? Metropolitan, it was a big, beautiful open-air stadium. You can see that they had lights for night games. Do any of you recall seeing Harmon Killebrew, Tony Olivia, Jim Cott, and others playing at Metropolitan Stadium? And before the Twins came, the Minneapolis Millers even played at Met Stadium for a time. And of course, we paid for about $1 billion or so to remake an open-air stadium today.
And nowadays, this is the same site as the Mall of America.
That's right. I was, right before the mall closed for a time, I was standing right there.
Really?
Just a couple weeks ago.
And
That's
still
where
today at the Mall of America, there's home plate.
There's still home plate. Doobie doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo, doobie doobie doo doo. It's the era of the musical in the 1950s. Some of the best musicals ever made came out in the 1950s.
I agree.
West Side Story, Sound of Music, My Fair Lady, and this gem, Singing in the Rain. So, though they didn't do this one, Oscar Hammerstein and Richard Rodgers really were the kings of the modern American musical. And the 1950s really was the time of the musical. And for a lot of people around the world, Brittany, it's quite interesting. In the 1950s, how they would think of Americans, they would think of them through Hollywood, through the lens of musicals. A lot of people hadn't been to America, but they'd see these musicals and thought we were all kind of just dancing down the street all the time, which frankly
wasn't always true.
Well, for me it is, but for most people it probably wasn't.
Oh.
Do you know that Gene Kelly did this scene? It took a week to film the famous Singing in the Rain scene. It took him a full week, and he had the flu.
Really?
He danced and sang with a fever, a sore throat, and body aches and chills while being poured on in the studio by cold water, and he did one of the most iconic song and dance numbers of all time.
You would have never known he did not feel well.
Well, they paid him a lot of money.
Wow.
Other, musicals, West Side Story, and Bye Bye Birdie, which is really about Elvis, but it's Birdie in that case.
Sound of music.
The hills are alive with the sound of music. I was hoping you would do that. And of course, the king or maybe queen of all musicals in the 50s was 1959's The Sound of Music, considered the greatest musical of all time by the American Film Institute. And it made Julie Andrews a household name. Well, Brittany, nothing makes me happier than food.
We know that.
Yes, and
It's no secret.
particularly processed food. I'm a lover of processed food. It just tastes better. And
I'm late, but dinner won't be.
so in the 1950s, the reality was in the 40s, the 30s, and before, my grandmother had to make a lot of things from scratch. But in the 1950s, frozen foods became a reality, freeze-dried foods, as well as canned and dried foods, which meant now you could make dinner in an instant, right? Birdseye, Clarence Birdseye gave us freeze-dried vegetables. Campbell's gave us millions of well, maybe not millions, but many kinds of soups to choose from.
Swanson Family Dinners.
Swanson TV Dinners, the complete frozen dinner. And there were many companies, Betty Crocker and Crisco and others, that made it easy to instantly bake cakes and pies and other things. So, the reality was making dinner became much easier in the 50s. I like this ad right here. Ooh, succotash. I've never been that excited for succotash in my life. Ooh, succotash.
And in February. And good. And cheap.
Thanks, Birdseye. Now, we're going to see some before and after photos, Brittany. Now, you're looking at a photograph that could be my grandmother in the 1940s. And this is what the laundry machines looked like before the 50s and the modern household technology came about. So you can see here a wringer. What clothes would go through the wringer and then be dried off. Here's the washing tub, and of course there's a hose. Many of you probably remember having a setup like this, maybe in your basement. But in the 1950s, life got a great deal easier, Brittany, with the modern washing machine. No more wringer washer for you. Bam. The electric machine is, and look how happy she is. Once more, not so happy. She's not happy. She is thrilled. So much better. Oh. Who enjoys washing and drying dishes? Do you remember having to do that? Sinks full of dishes because your family of 8 just got done with dinner. And then John and Martha are going to come over later for coffee cake. More dishes for you to do. But wait, in the 1950s, the dishwasher was born. And suddenly, John and Martha can come over for coffee cake anytime. But maybe not John because he's kind of annoying. But the dishwasher. I love the dishwasher because I hate doing dishes.
I don't have a dishwasher, Mark.
So Brittany, this is still you.
I'm still living in the 1940s.
This is still Brittany. You have no dishwasher in your apartment.
Dishwasher.
I do. Ding. Now, before the 50s, you might remember the ice box. The iceman would come to your door, deliver a big sheet of a cube of ice. It would keep foods cold, like your milk and your eggs. That darn iceman better come on time because you gotta keep your groceries nice and chilled. But in the 1950s, bam, people began to get the refrigerator by Amana, Maytag, and more. Brittany, do you remember getting your first refrigerator?
It was before I was born, Mark. I want to say when I was brought home from the hospital, there was a refrigerator there waiting for me.
That's an incredible story, Brittany. Thank you. Look at this. This is actually quite a spacious refrigerator. Do any of you remember having an ice box in your home? Brittany, do you remember when? Start us out, Brittany.
When families spent time together around the dining room table, playing board games, playing cards.
Yahtzee.
There was just an emphasis on togetherness back in the 50s.
It's so true. Nowadays, kids are going here, they're going there.
They're all over the place.
They're all over the place, or they're on their gizmos. They're not at the table playing Parcheesi, but they used to be. I remember it used to be home by 6, stay for dinner, and on Friday nights, it was family game night, Brittany.
Really?
It wasn't, but, that's what it should have been like. No, my family, we pretty much just did whatever he did. But you can see in the 50s, that was pretty common. Also to wear a shirt and tie, apparently, in order to play a board game.
It's a requirement. People had dinner together.
Brittany, does your husband look like that when he comes home and you've made a roast?
He's the one that would make the roast, not me.
That was a little.
Our
there was some
roles changed
assumptions being made.
Years.
The roles have changed, but families had dinner together. Nowadays, they're running off all over the place, but families used to have dinner. And matter of fact, parents used to say, "Don't leave the table, young lady, until you clean your plate."
Mark, when you were growing up, did you have to ask to be excused from the dinner table?
No.
You didn't?
No, I'm a product of the 80s, and it was sort of like, I'm going, and I just leave my plate at the table, and my mom would clear it.
Wow. I would have to ask to be excused.
Really?
Yes. May I be excused? And then if you didn't finish your vegetables per se, it would be, no, you may not be excused, but you can finish your vegetables.
Now that sounds like the 50s. Are you sure you weren't born in the 50s? The Sunday drive. Many of you might remember this, that maybe after church, or if you didn't go to church, maybe you just got up after sleeping in a little bit, had a nice breakfast, and boom, out the door you'd go. Mom, Dad, sister, brother, Sparky the dog, And why your neighbors would come with, I have no idea who these people are.
It's aunt and uncle.
I didn't want to invite them. I did not invite them.
Is this you with Sparky?
This is me, but I don't know who these two people are. But anyways, they're sitting next to my son and Sparky the dog. And
oh, you're the dad now.
I'm the dad. And you'd go with my fedora, and you'd go on a Sunday drive. Maybe you'd go for a picnic, maybe you'd go to the lake. But I bet many of you remember the Sunday drive.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to the door? Notice the car it's missing an entire...
Yeah. I think it's just to let us have a view into the car. We are imagining there is no door.
You're very perceptive.
Back in the 50s, you knew your neighbors. You had the white picket fence. You saw your neighbor, Hal, across the way.
Hal, oh my God, Hal, yes.
He was over in his yard, weeding the bushes.
Maybe some of the neighbors would come over and you guys would play a game of canasta.
Yeah, people spent time together.
People did.
People knew their neighbors.
Now,
They would make a casserole for each other.
They would make a casserole for each other. Have some lemonade ready to go.
Yes.
My father, who grew up in the 50s, would tell me stories all the time of how he'd be home on the weekend or during the summer, and the neighbor ladies would just come over, and my grandmother always had a dress on. She always looked nice because you never knew who was going to come to the door. She'd give them iced tea or coffee, and they might play a game of cards or just gossip. The dads all knew each other too. I mean, nowadays, I gotta be honest with you, nowadays you don't always know your neighbors. You might wave at them, but we don't take a lot of time to get to know the people around us. Maybe that'll change after all of this. But, yeah, you knew your neighbors in the 50s. And you knew your local what?
Looks like we have a pharmacy, a mail carrier, a milkman. You remember getting your milk delivered to your house, your front doorstep? And what do we have down here?
Looks like maybe a grocer or a butcher, that's right. Do you recall knowing most of these people? You knew the mail person, you knew your local pharmacist. Again, we go to Walgreens now, I have no idea who the pharmacist is. You don't go to a butcher anymore, you go to Cub.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very impersonal. But in those days, you really did know the people that delivered products and cared for you and cared for your family. They'd look out for you.
Full-service gas stations. Back in the 50s, the gas station attendants would pump your gas for you. They would sweep out your car.
Wipe your windshield, check your oil levels.
Put air in your tires. It's full service, just for stopping by.
And they dressed up in uniforms.
Interesting. With bow ties.
With bow ties. I know it seems silly, but really a person could work as a gas station attendant. You wouldn't be rolling in the money, but you could actually have a small home. You could have a car. You could have a small family. You could actually support yourself doing some of these jobs back then.
Would they take tips? Would you tip your gas station?
I don't know the answer. I bet somebody in the audience might know. Did you tip your gas station attendants? I would guess maybe you did.
Mm-hmm.
Who knows? But the idea was, you'd expect service. Now you go to the gas station, you do it all yourself, and you're lucky if when you go in to get a pack of gum or some coffee, that you're lucky if they look up and say, thanks, have a nice day. Because usually you're the one saying that. I love this picture.
$1 for a Sunday matinee.
I think you all remember that. Yes, who remembers going to the Saturday or Sunday matinees? And these would be all afternoon events. You'd get there and you'd spend maybe 2-3 hours at the matinees. There'd be sort of a pre-show and then there'd be the main show. There'd be ads and stuff in between. So look at that. They must be watching something real funny, like maybe Donald Duck or something, or who knows.
They're laughing. They're having a great time.
They're having a great time.
It looks like maybe they brought some donuts to the theater.
And look, no parents.
No parents.
No, nowadays you would never just leave your kid in a movie theater. It's a really bad idea. But in those days, my dad would just walk with his brothers up to the movie. Parents would give him maybe $1 or 75 cents, and that was it. No one worried about those things.
Malted milk. This is where you would find me in the 50s.
I'd be there all day.
I would be eating all the malted milk.
You would, if it was chocolate.
So would you.
Yes. This, you might remember the soda counters. Remember those grills? And you'd find them at pharmacies and at department stores. There was always a soda jerk, and you might get a sundae, a malt. You could get a grilled cheese or a hamburger sometimes. They were everywhere. Woolworths was a good, Kresge's.
Bridgman's?
Bridgman's, and Bridgman's was around when I was a kid. There were still Bridgman's all over the place when I was young. But yeah, look at that. And it was like maybe a quarter to go and get like a sundae.
I could go for a sundae right now.
I am so hungry. I think after this slideshow, Brittany, we should go and just get food.
Especially Sundays.
Let's get a sundae and a double cheeseburger and a veggie burger. And young love was innocent.
Look at those sweethearts.
I love how they're sharing a malted.
Yes.
Nowadays, like
It
right
looks
now,
like-
you should not do this, by the way.
You should not. You should have your own straw.
And your own malt.
On the right there looks like a prom date.
Right, yeah, some kind of formal. Look at that V-neck
Do you
sweater.
remember dressing up for the prom? Or being asked to the prom? Or asking someone to the prom?
Or not being asked to the prom. Boo. We don't want to talk about that.
Bad memories.
But prom memories are wonderful. And you know, in those days, when you went on a date, you dressed up. You dressed up. You didn't wear ripped jeans and a t-shirt. This guy's wearing a nice sweater, dress shirt, and a necktie. Look at that. Those were good times. It was a big deal to hold someone's hand back then. You know, things have just changed so much, but it was a more innocent time, I think we can all agree. My father has fond memories of cruising Main Street in St. Paul.
Really?
Oh yes, he truly does. He remembers that in those days, you'd be driving along on a Saturday evening, you'd see some friends pull up at a stoplight, and you'd literally get out of the car and go into another car. That really was not uncommon.
Wow.
Hey, Richie, Stewie, where are you going off to? Oh, we're gonna go get a malted over at whatever's. Hey, hang on. You jump out of one car and go into the next, and off they drive.
That's a lot of kids in one car.
Look at that. That doesn't. I think you'd get a ticket
Times have
doing this
changed.
now. You would get a ticket or even arrested doing this now. Does anybody remember cruising along the streets? Your main street in your hometown?
The idea was kind of just to stick to Main Street. You were just kind of going
Up and down Main Street.
up and down Main Street.
It's where it's at.
You got to be seen.
You gotta be seen. It's where you'd find people. Main Street, at the drive-in, at a local cafe, but there was always the places you knew where to go to find your friends.
People dressed up to go out. If they were leaving their house, they were in a dress or a suit.
It's very true. I think you all might remember that when you went out, even if it was just going out, whether it was going out to dinner, going out with friends, going out to a movie, you put on makeup, you put on a sport coat or a suit, dressed to the nines. Going out was an event. You went downtown to a nice restaurant, you saw a show somewhere, you, again, didn't wear jeans and a t-shirt. You looked nice when you went out. Again, I think really I could be a stand-in for this actor here. I really, probably even like a little better looking, but I mean, that definitely is.
Has anyone ever told you look like John Hamm?
I look a lot like John Hamm.
You get that a lot?
I'm his stand-in. And here's downtown, I believe this might be Minneapolis, or am I as long as it's St. Paul? But you can see some of the stores that are no longer around. Woolworth and Company, Kresge, remember going to Kresge's? So this is just a little snapshot of what Hennepin Avenue or whatever might have looked like back in the 1950s or early 60s. Woolworths, yes.
Department stores started to dominate downtown St. Paul and Minneapolis. Donaldson's in downtown Minneapolis.
I used to shop at
Then
Donaldson's.
became a Dayton's and a Macy's.
Yeah. Powers, some of you might remember there was a store called Powers. The Golden Rule was one. The Emporium, my father worked at the Emporium in the warehouse.
Really?
Yes, he actually did. the Golden Rules and W.T. Grant, Rothschilds. So there were a lot of big department stores in downtown Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's where you went to shop. There was no Southdale until later on in the late 50s. There was no Southdale to go to. Donaldson's is now, most of these are gone now.
Do you remember elevator operators? Someone who would ride the elevator with you, press the floor you're going to, and escort you to that floor?
That's right. Hats and hosiery on the 4th floor. You know, it was a job that just has vanished into the sands of time. No more elevator operators.
Southdale Mall in the 1950s.
Southdale was really the beginning of the end of the big downtown department stores. It was the first suburban mall in Minnesota. It was the first closed mall. In other words, it wasn't in the country, that's right. So in the wintertime, you didn't have to freeze parking downtown and walking to Woolworths. You could just go into the parking lot and go into this nice warm mall in Southdale. And as people began to shop more in the suburbs, the department stores began to lose money. And that's also when Target would come about as well, a little bit later in the 50s. The idea that the suburbs needed their own shopping. You didn't want to take a bus or a streetcar into the city anymore. This is actually a picture of early Southdale Mall. And finally, the weekends. The weekends were for dancing, Brittany. I think the weekends sometimes still are for dancing, but
Yeah.
dancing in the 40s and the 50s, it's what you did. Friday night, Saturday, you went out and you danced. If I tried this, I would probably break every bone in my body. And drop my poor wife on the ground while I was doing it. It doesn't look very comfortable.
It doesn't.
I don't know, Brittany, you do actually go dancing, don't you?
Yeah, swing dancing.
Kind of like that.
Not quite like that. A little simpler and not as complicated looking. But it is fun to get out and dance.
If you can.
Highly recommend it.
So I bet many of you here in the audience remember going out dancing with your friends, with your romantic interests, with your spouses on the weekends. That was the thing to do. Here's actually a photograph, and you can see the band here is LW. That is Lawrence Welk. Well, we're really almost out of time. Very quickly, some fads of the 50s. You might remember the drive-in diners and the car hops. Sometimes they wore roller skates. Places like Porky's. And there is Porky's. You can see that this is right here in Minneapolis. Drive-in movies. Many of you remember going to the drive-in theaters. And of course, if you can name this movie, Brittany will give you $1 billion.
I won't, but
Okay,
I'll congratulate you.
That is the 10 Commandments, by the way, with Charlton Heston. Cars with fins was all the rage.
They
And
were
if you
heavy cars.
They were heavy, they were big, a lot of metal on these cars. And of course, now, if you had a car like this, they'd be worth quite a bit of money. Did any of you have a car like this? The TV Westerns, Davy Crockett was big. Roy Rogers, The Lone Ranger. I mean, these were the big Westerns, were huge in the 1950s. Some of you boys and gals might have had little fake cap guns and coonskin caps. My father had a Roy Rogers lunchbox. And the ladies might go to the Tupperware parties, because Tupperware was all the rage. And by the way, we all still have Tupperware.
I have some of the Tupperware from my grandmother from the 50s. It withstands
That might be a
the test of
collectible.
time.
That might be actually a collectible Tupperware from the 50s.
They don't make things like they used to.
No, they do not. The letter jackets, the letter jackets and letter sweaters were all the rage. And sometimes the boyfriend would actually give his girlfriend his letter jacket
Wouldn't
to
he get
wear.
cold?
He would get cold, but it was supposed to be chivalrous. Poodle skirts, capris, and saddle shoes. I bet those bring back some memories. I apologize for going so fast, but we are running short on time, but some of you might remember having some of these things, and of course the poodle skirts. Men's hair, things like the pompadour, the crew cut. Some influences of women's hairstyles in the 50s. You can recognize some of these actresses like Marilyn Monroe, Grace Kelly, Doris Day,
Audrey Hepburn,
Sophia Loren, and Elizabeth Taylor. We're out of time, and we're out of show. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed our little walk through the 1950s. I'm sorry we had to rush it a little bit, but I hope it brought back some great memories for you. We'll see you again tomorrow. In the interim, stay classy, friends.